Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I came into the studio this morning planning on making an emulation guide like I would normally do, but there's been so many things happening over the past 24 hours that I think it's better suited to actually do a check-in video. So I want to talk about everything that's happened over the past day or so and where I see things going, both for my channel as well as just emulation in general. There's a lot to talk about here, and I've got a couple bullet points here, but otherwise it's not going to be a very fancy video at all. I'm just going to mostly talk about some of my thoughts when it comes to Yuzu and Citra and all the things that have happened. So without any further delay, let's just go ahead and dive right in. Okay, let's start with what happened. So last week, Nintendo dropped a lawsuit on Yuzu, that's a Nintendo Switch emulator, and it was settled out of court yesterday for $2.4 million. Now, in addition to the monetary settlement, there was also other stipulations. So one of them was that Yuzu released a statement, basically saying that they were going to close down everything because they now feel that their app encourages piracy. It was very kind of lawyer-esque in their wording and everything like that, but all the same, the damage was done. Now, on top of that, like I mentioned, in their statement, they said they were going to drop everything, and they did. So their GitHub is closed, their website is down, their source code has been removed, and those assets have now been seized by Nintendo. Now, the other side of that coin that a lot of us did not see coming is that they also did the same for the Citra emulator. That's the 3DS emulator. You might be wondering why Yuzu was closing down and then Citra was also a part of that. And that's because the main developer worked on both. And so I think that there was probably some sort of connection there. And so yes, they've both been dropped altogether. And so yesterday was a pretty crazy day. A lot of people were going onto like archive websites and trying to download the latest version so that way they at least had the most modern version for their own personal use. I think the major damage here is going to be the fact that there's no further development. We'll talk about that later, but as it stands right now, there was just a lot of scrambling happening within the emulation world. And I think there were a lot of people who were just upset that it happened in the first place. You know, it's kind of taking away their ability to play certain games or whatever. And a lot of people were wondering why it happened as well. So let's talk about that next. Now, bear in mind, there's a lot of conjecture here and a lot of things going on. But I think one of the major arguments that I saw on Twitter and social media and whatnot was that this happened because people were emulating a modern console. It's okay to emulate something that no longer is available for purchase, but something like a Nintendo Switch is. And so because of that, there's just an additional scrutiny to that. And I totally respect that. I think that a lot of people don't want to touch a modern system because it doesn't feel like retro game emulation or game preservation at that point. Now, there are some development teams who have a hard line in the sand, and I totally respect that as well. Batocera is one of those examples. They don't officially support Nintendo Switch emulation at all because it's a current console. So everything goes up to like Wii U and PS3 with all their software and documentation. It is possible to sideload it. There are videos out there to show you how to do that, at least as of yesterday before Yuzu shut down. And so there were ways to actually play those on Batocera, but you had to do it yourself. And I think that was a pretty good stance for those development teams. So I do agree that with modern consoles, there's an increased level of scrutiny, specifically when it comes to piracy, you know, people who are bad actors downloading these games without owning them in the first place. That does cut into Nintendo's profits, and that does increase the scrutiny where they're trying to make as much money as possible. Now, it does get wonky when you think about Citra, which also closed down yesterday. That's a Nintendo 3DS emulator, and the eShop for that closed last year. So there's no legitimate way to buy eShop games anymore. The only way to actually play them is to do it through emulation or to buy a secondhand cartridge. Neither of those are going to make Nintendo any money in the first place. So they've kind of abandoned their own console. And so that's a little bit weirder where there's only one real way to actually play these games. And even then that emulator closed down too. Now, another example people were giving was the fact that Yuzu itself was making money off their Patreon page. And this one's also a little bit nuanced and pretty sensitive, so I assume people are going to disagree with me about this as well. When it comes down to it, Yuzu had an early access program where if you were a patron, and I was a patron, then you would get early access to the app and all the new development they've been doing on the app and emulator. Now, the thing that kind of made it really kind of weird is the sense that if you think about like Tears of the Kingdom, for example, when that first released, the early access people had code base that actually made the game work. And so once the game was out, you could use the EA version of Yuzu and then play the game. If you didn't pay for it and you had just the regular version, you had to wait about 2 weeks until the code was updated. And so there was like this 2-week paywall, basically, that if you wanted to play Tears of the Kingdom on Yuzu, then you had to be a patron. And so as a result, they're basically forcing you to pay or paywalling it in order for you to be able to play that game. That's only one game in particular. For me personally, I just like having the most updated things, and so that's why I always use Patreon. That way I could have like the early access version for showing all my hardware demonstrations. And so yes, in that specific use case, I think that Yuzu was profiting off a specific game and their emulator tool. Now, if everything was just free and open source, there was no early access version, for example, then I think that that wouldn't have been much of an argument for Nintendo to kind of make, but because Yuzu set themselves up like that, I understand why they probably were hesitant to try to bring it to court. Now, the third part that I wanted to mention within this section about why it happened in the first place is that I think that content creators, myself included, are at least partially responsible for this kind of all blowing up in the first place. After all, we've got these videos out there that show these amazing things you can do with Nintendo Switch emulation, and I think that encouraged people to seek it out or maybe buy a handheld that could play Nintendo Switch. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons why it's exciting to emulate Nintendo Switch, and I still kind of stand by that. After all, I love playing this on my Steam Deck or any other handheld, but I also love the enhancements that come from emulation. For example, if you have good enough hardware, you can enhance the graphical resolution or the frame rates, or you can even implement cheats using these emulators and the mods and everything else like that. And I've always really enjoyed that. Specifically, if we're talking about like Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, I love the fact that I could use a cheat that would increase the durability of my weapons, for example. That way I didn't have to sit there and search out a new weapon all the time. I could just play the game on my own terms. And so I love that idea of enhancing the gameplay experience through emulation. Now, whether or not we should have been doing that on a modern console is a whole different story, and I totally understand both sides of those arguments. When I was making those videos, the thought that I had was, well, I'm never going to directly encourage any sort of piracy or anything else like that, or even emulation in general. I just wanted to kind of show it as a hardware benchmark. If you do want to do the thing where you legitimately dump your cartridge and all that kind of stuff, again, something I never showed on my website or on my YouTube channel, then I would show how the hardware would work on specific devices if you had that all set up. Now, I think like with the Yuzu app, there is ways that this is also enhancing or encouraging people to pirate games. And so I totally understand that responsibility there. And it makes sense, just when you show off something, there are going to be bad actors out there who are going to do something illegal with that information. Whether or not we should have showed that information in the first place is obviously up for debate, and I'd love to hear your comments about that down below. And I'm definitely seeing that experience ripple through the emulation community over the past 24 hours. For example, if you go on like the Odin subreddit, you can see a bunch of people saying, I was about to buy this thing, but should I do it now because I planned on playing Nintendo Switch and 3DS games on it? So people are questioning whether or not they want to get this device in the first place because some of those enhanced features they were planning on buying it for are no longer options, at least easily. And so I understand why people are hesitant about that, and that's part of one of the reasons why I'm making this video in the first place. Okay, now that we talked about what happened and why it happened, at least in my opinion, let's talk about why this matters in the first place. There are quite a few people out there who are expressing grief or loss in the sense that they no longer have these future updates, and they're worried about what this means for emulation in general. So let's start with the Nintendo Switch. Now, I have an Odin 2, and I love playing Switch games on it. It enhances the experience way over the original hardware. For example, I can play games in docked mode in a handheld. That means I can play them in 1080p. They're going to look great, and the buttons all feel great as well. On top of that, I can play other systems on that same handheld. So it's awesome to be able to turn this thing on and play Nintendo and Genesis and Super Nintendo and GameCube and PS2, and then also Nintendo Switch games on it. It's like an all-in-one package. I only have to take one handheld with me when I go on a trip. So that has always been something that's been pretty awesome about Nintendo Switch emulation on something like the Odin 2. And so for me, it does feel like a little bit of a loss in the sense that if there's a future Nintendo Switch game that comes out and it's not compatible with the current or latest version of Yuzu, then I'm just going to be out of luck. And so I get that, right? But then also there is a bright spot in the sense that you can still play it on original hardware. You can buy these games and play them as Nintendo intends for you to play them. So in that sense, it's not a huge loss for me because we're not losing these games outright. We're just losing an enhanced feature of playing Yuzu or other Switch emulators on the Odin 2. Now, when it comes to Citra, the Nintendo 3DS emulator, that one feels like a more legitimate loss to me. If you think about it, there were many games that were released on the eShop only, which means they didn't have a cartridge made for them, you can't buy them secondhand, and with the eShop closed, there's no legitimate way to buy those digital games. Instead, you have to use an alternative shop with original hardware, or you have to resort to emulation. And Citra emulation was not perfect. There were many games that were not fully compatible, which means that with no longer having any further development, those games may not become more compatible compatible in the future. And so there will be games that just are going to be unplayable unless you have the original hardware and you happen to have bought it on the eShop already before they shut it down. Those are the only ways that you can legitimately play those games, and that, I think, population is going to be shrinking over time. Now, thankfully, Nintendo announced their 3DS eShop closure, and so a lot of people saw that coming, and from a preservation standpoint, there were people who backed up the entire eShop. And so as a result, some of these options are still out there, just not in a legitimate way that Nintendo would actually approve. After all, they want you to buy with their hardware and then play only in the ways that they allow. But the thing is, it's not a very customer-friendly way of doing things. To give you an example, I bought the Nintendo Wii, back in 2006 or whatever, and they opened up the virtual console shop like in 2007. And man, I spent so much money buying all those digital games. At the time, I didn't know anything about emulation, and so I loved the idea of being able to play Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 games on my Nintendo Wii. Now, the experience wasn't that great, but all the same, it was super cool to just have them all together. All of a sudden, the Wii U comes out, they close down the virtual console and the eShop on the Wii, and then all of a sudden, I'm supposed to buy those games all over again if I wanted to play them. Nowadays, things are a little bit different with the Nintendo Switch store, like you have to have the online service to be able to play those games that they allow you to play. So all the same, it's kind of the same thing where we're having to re-buy these games, and it's one of those where it's all on Nintendo's terms. This isn't a preservation thing. They're just kind of owning it themselves and deciding which games you get to play from your past and which way you can actually play them. And at some point, I do expect the Switch eShop to close, and there are thousands of games on that system, and so I'm really worried about what's going to happen from a preservation standpoint at that point. You think about these indie developers who put these games on the Nintendo eShop, and then all of a sudden, if the eShop closes, there's no way to buy those games. They're just out of luck. All that work that they made is just gone into the ether. And so that's where preservation comes into play, and emulation as well. And so that's kind of one of the things that I see as being like why this matters in the first place, in that emulation can be used for preservation, where we can keep these games running and everything else like that. I would love for my kids to be able to play some random eShop game that they played as a kid as an adult, like I do with my NES games. I think it's super awesome to be able to revisit those memories. And I want to have my kids have that same experience, 20, 30 years in the future. So yeah, I think that's why it matters in the first place. So let's talk about where I see things going and what's going to be coming up next. There's a few things to talk about here, and I think this section will be pretty long. The first is the fact that we have other emulators out there. For example, Ryujinx is a Nintendo Switch emulator. I've never really liked that one as much as Yuzu. I think the interface is just not quite as good, but it still works okay. And I'm really curious to see how this is going to play out in the future in terms of lawsuits from Nintendo and things like that. Ryujinx is mostly based out of Brazil, and so I'm not sure how international law is going to work in that regard, but I am curious to see how that works. So if you are really desperate to play Nintendo Switch games in a legitimate way, then Ryujinx is still available and is probably going to be further actively developed. Even their developers have said so. There's also a 3DS emulator called Panda 3DS that's been in the works for quite some time. I don't think it's publicly available yet, but I do expect that to release at some point. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all kind of plays out when it comes to, Yuzu and Citra being shut down and Yuzu being fined, $2.4 million. How many people are going to want to get involved in emulation at that point with those specific consoles? If other people are getting smacked down with monetary issues, then I don't see other people like going and lining up to want to develop for the alternatives because of that fear of maybe having some sort of monetary punishment. There's also a Citra 3DS core on RetroArch, so I'm curious to see how that's all going to play out as well. Again, I have no idea how that's going to work, but I'm just kind of sitting on the sidelines to see what kind of options we're going to have in the future. And like I mentioned, there are people out there who have backed up and preserved the latest builds of like Citra and Yuzu, so those are available for people. They're not going to be further developed, and Nintendo now has that source code, but it'll be interesting to see if there are any forks that come out of that. People talk about like emulation being a hydra, where you cut off one head, other heads pop up. So I'm really interested to see how that's all going to play out in the future. The other thing to look at is going to be the other softwares that are associated with emulation. For example, something like EmuDeck, which pre-installs the emulators for you, or like Emulation Station, which is used as a front end and allows you to launch these things. Now, EmuDeck has already come out and dropped support for Yuzu and Citra on EmuDeck. So when you try to install EmuDeck, it's not going to pre-install those for you or anything else like that. But they have approached it with a different thing, and I think this is kind of unique. They're calling it like bring your own Yuzu. So for example, if you already have your Yuzu copy and you install it, the configurations will still work. And I think that's a pretty good middle ground, where they're not actively encouraging anyone to use Yuzu or anything else like that. but the support is still going to be there. They're not at least deleting it outright from their app right now. Now, something else I've noticed that I didn't expect, and I think this is a result of the things that have happened over the past 24 hours, is that Drastic, the Nintendo DS emulator, this is available on the Google Play Store for usually $5 or $6. It's now gone free. And so this may be something as a result of that, where they're like, you know what, we should be making money off of Nintendo work. And so as a result, we're just going to make this free. And the thing is, a bummer about that is that, you know, these developers should be compensated for their time, not necessarily to pay for the app specifically, but maybe, you know, some sort of donation or things like that. And so I do hope that there's still a way to compensate these people who are putting in all this time and effort for preservation and emulation and all other kind of stuff. And finally, the last aspect within this whole kind of what's next section is the fact that we're going to be experiencing what I'm going to call brain drain here in the emulation community. These developer teams who were part of like Yuzu and Citra had spent years learning all that stuff, the skill set that they had in order to emulate on those systems, all the ins and outs. So for example, when a new game comes out, they could figure out, okay, this is the same problem we've seen with other games, and they use that wisdom to kind of move things further. And that's all like that kind of knowledge thing. And that's going to be a loss because those people are no longer going to be working on those apps. And so it makes me worried about how emulation development will happen with those systems going forward. Now, there are being people who are making forks of like Yuzu, for example. There's one called Yuzu and Suzu. They've probably already been taken down by the time of this video. But all the same, there are people who are interested in kind of continuing that work, but they don't have that background where they've been working on it for years. So there's going to be a time where just kind of the development kind of slows, and that's that brain drain aspect. And so I'm a little bit worried about that and what that means for preservation and emulation in the future, specifically with those two platforms. We'll see how that goes in the future though. Okay, so the last topic I want to talk about in this video is what does it mean for this channel, for Retro Game Core in particular? What things am I going to change about the way that I make content, specifically when it comes to Yuzu and Citra, you know, these two emulators? Now, first thing is I do not plan on taking down any of my old videos. Now, I don't know if Nintendo's going to go on a rampage and start taking things down. I'll have to adapt accordingly at that point. But as it stands, I don't really like taking down old videos in the first place. And so I'm going to keep all those up. There is no specific like Switch jailbreak video or anything else like that. So I think that in general, most of my stuff is going to be hardware performance testing anyway with those specific emulators. So I'm not worried about it in that kind of stuff. And so I'll be keeping those videos up. Now, I am going to change the links on my websites. I have a bunch of written guides, and a lot of those will link to like Citra and Yuzu, and those links are dead at this point. So I'll probably be removing all those dead links. I don't plan on removing the content, you know, like saying, hey, this is the settings that I recommend for this specific app or anything else like that. Really, I'm just going to remove those links, and that's about it. Now, when it comes to hardware testing, this is where things get a little bit weird. After all, I do a lot of hardware reviews. You know, I'll have a mini PC or a handheld PC or things like that. And so I will use these platforms as a way of showing what the performance potential is going to be for any of those handhelds. Now, Nintendo is not the only system that I emulate on this channel. You know, I have like Xbox 360 and PS3 emulation. All those are different benchmarks. You know, there are different nuances to each of those emulators. So I like to show a little bit of each of them in each of my reviews. Now, I'm probably going to change things up. I don't plan on doing like Nintendo Switch or 3DS emulation in the future unless we have a viable emulation option that I think is going to be relatively safe to show off both for my channel and for users. And I've heard a lot of people saying, you know, you should just treat it like Aether SX2. That's the PS2 emulator on Android. It just stopped development. The developer left and we have like a final build, and that's the one that I use for all of my testing. Now, it's a little bit different when it comes to Yuzu and Citra. I could, yes, use those latest builds and say, okay, here's the last build that we have. Here's how the emulation performance is going to be. And I'm still kind of thinking about that, but I think there's a distinction between the two. Aether SX2 quit because the developer didn't want to develop anymore. So it just kind of got stalled right then and there. Now, Yuzu and Citra were taken down by Nintendo. Those assets were seized by Nintendo. And so that is a different story. That's me saying, like, in the face of Nintendo, hey, these are your apps now, but I'm just going to still show them off. And so that's a little bit further across the line than I'm comfortable showing. And so as it stands right now, I don't plan on showing Citra and Yuzu emulation, at least directly in my hardware reviews for the time being, but I may think of other clever ways to do that. And so if you have any ideas, again, let me know in the comments down below. This is an ongoing conversation at this point. Now, another thing I've been thinking about with this channel, just because of this whole fiasco over the past 24 hours, is getting back to hardware videos about the original 3DS. Now, I did a few videos about that last year, including how to jailbreak a 3DS, how to play 3DS games, like dumping the cartridge onto an SD card, things like that, and then also how to play original DS games on a 3DS as well. Now, at the time, I kind of stopped all my video making at that point because Nintendo released a new update for the 3DS that basically broke a lot of the jailbreaking measures, and so I paused everything to allow those jailbreakers to kind of figure out a new method and kind of update their own guides. And then also I thought, well, if Nintendo's actively updating this device, even if it is just to discourage, jailbreaking, it's still something that I kind of wanted to pause and back off from. But I think that now is probably a good time to get back into that. And so I do have a couple ideas for that, including retro game emulation on a 3DS, including Game Boy Advance. But then also I bought a Japanese region 3DS, last year, and I still haven't really touched it because I wanted to wait for that whole jailbreaking thing to set up. And so I think that's another possible video option right there is, the 3DSs that you can buy from Japan are in better shape and usually are cheaper, and then how to show how to get that working in English and other languages, so that way you can enjoy that as well. Anyway, that's really about it for this video. I just kind of wanted to talk through all the things that have happened over the past 24 hours or past week really, and just what that all kind of means for this channel and emulation in general. I hope this was informative in the sense that I kind of touched on some aspects you maybe haven't thought of, and maybe there are things that I hadn't thought of either. So let me know down in the comments. I've said that like 10 times in this video already, but I do want this to be a continuing conversation where we all just kind of figure this out together. Now, I get it. There are opinions all over the place. You shouldn't be emulating Nintendo Switch. You should be. It's better to play them on Odin 2 or whatever. I get all of those arguments. I'm not here to say that one's better than the other. What I am here to say is just, how are we going to do this? How are we going to preserve these games? How are we going to emulate these? How are my kids going to be able to play these games in the future? And how can we set that up right now? Anyway, as always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.